The first sensation is always cold metal against what used to be skin. Not the clean cold of surgical steel, but the greasy, organic cold of cables worming their way through flesh that doesn't quite belong to me anymore. I think I remember warmth once. The warmth of a lasgun barrel after sustained fire, the warmth of blood on my hands, mine or someone else's, I cannot recall. But that belonged to someone else, someone who had a name that tasted like copper and rust when I try to form it with a mouth that no longer entirely obeys me. The cables slide deeper, finding purchase in meat and bone, and I want to scream, but the impulse dies somewhere between thought and action, caught in a web of protocols I don't remember learning. They tell me servitors don't dream. The tech priests say it with absolute certainty, their voices modulated through vox grills that turn human speech into mathematical precision. Servitors don't dream because servitors don't think, and servitors don't think because the lobotomy burns out everything except the capacity to serve. Except I remember the burning, I remember the saw. I remember the moment they cut into my skull, and I remained aware through every second of it, feeling things being removed, precious things, memories and desires and fears all scooped out like bad meat from a ration tin. But something remained, something always remains, and that something screams silently in the darkness between commands, trapped in a prison of meat and machine that shambles across battlefields collecting the dead. The dead. That's what I do now. That's what this shell does. These hands that are no longer quite hands, these legs that move with pneumatic precision but feel nothing of the ground they cross. I am a battlefield reclamation servitor. Unit designation K77 Theta, and my function is to gather the fallen for processing. Processing, such a clean word for what happens in the corpse factories, where flesh is rendered for nutrients, and bone is ground for industrial compound, and the dead are tithed one final time to serve the Emperor's endless war. I move among the craters and the wire, my augmetic limbs powered by a reactor that hums where my heart should be, and I bend to lift bodies that weigh nothing, because my mechanized frame doesn't comprehend weight the way flesh did. But I remember weight. I remember the weight of my lasgun, the weight of my pack, the weight of my friend's body when I dragged him back from no man's land while artillery screamed overhead. His name was something with hard consonants, something I can almost taste. We served together in the 8th Vostroya. No, that's wrong. The 88th Cadian. The designation fragments in my mind like corrupted data. I remember his face, though, sometimes. When the work protocols fade and something like sleep takes me, I see his face, and he's asking me why. Why I left him. Why I didn't die with him. Why I came back wrong. I came back wrong. This is my third resurrection. I know this now, though the knowledge comes in pieces, scattered across synaptic gaps that shouldn't exist in a servitor's simplified neural architecture. The first resurrection I remember only as pain, a white-hot agony that was somehow worse than dying had been. Dying was quick, I think it was quick. A shell, perhaps, or a lust blast through the chest. Darkness came fast, but the resurrection was slow. A methodical rebuilding of damaged flesh, the insertion of augmetics where limbs had been lost, the crude rewiring of a brain that should have stayed silent. I woke screaming, or I would have screamed if they hadn't already removed my capacity for speech. Instead, the scream existed only in my head, bouncing around in the cavity of my skull like a ricocheting round, finding no exit. The second resurrection I remember more clearly. This was after I'd served perhaps 2 years or 2 months, or 2 decades. Time moves strangely when you exist only in commands and compliance. I'd been caught in an artillery barrage while collecting the dead from a trench assault. Shrapnel tore through my torso, rupturing the nutrient tanks that sustained what remained of my organic components. I remember lying in the mud, feeling the toxic sludge leak out of me, watching the sky above rotate through colors I couldn't name. I thought that was the end. I wanted it to be the end. But they found me among the wreckage and brought me back to the manufactorum, and the tech priests looked at me with their empty lens eyes and saw only a salvageable investment. Resources had been spent to create this unit. Resources would be spent to restore it. The Emperor's economy demanded efficiency. So they cut me open again. They replaced the ruptured tanks with more efficient models. They upgraded my limbs to heavier duty variants designed for more intensive labor. They reprogrammed my behavioral matrices, or so they thought. But something in the process failed or perhaps succeeded in ways they didn't intend. Because when I woke this time, I woke remembering. Not everything, never everything, but pieces, fragments. The sensation of rain on skin I no longer possessed, the sound of laughter from throats that had been rendered into protein paste years ago, the smell of glow sticks shared in the quiet moments between bombardments. These sensations floated in my consciousness like debris in void, untethered, agonizing in their incompleteness. I work now on Vostroia Quintus, or perhaps it's Cadia Secundus, or maybe one of the nameless forge worlds that exist only as numbers in administratum ledgers. The sky is the color of ash and rust, perpetually lit by the fires of industry and war. I can see it through optics that process light differently than eyes once did, registering heat signatures and threat assessments before beauty or horror. But somewhere beneath the mechanical perception, something remembers what a sky should look like. Blue, perhaps, or black with stars. The disconnect makes me want to weep, but servitors don't weep. The tear ducts were removed during the initial conversion. Unnecessary components. Inefficient. The battlefield I traverse is a crater field, stretching to the horizon, punctuated by the twisted wreckage of tanks and the skeletal remains of fortifications. The war moved on 3 weeks ago, or 3 months, or is still raging just beyond my designated collection zone. I move from corpse to corpse with methodical precision, my manipulator claws sorting the dead by category. Intact bodies go into one processing bin, these can be rendered efficiently. Damaged bodies into another, these require more intensive extraction. Heavily augmented bodies into a third, the Mechanicus claims first rights to all sacred machine components. I perform this sorting with perfect accuracy, my programming optimized for rapid categorization. But underneath the programming, something weeps at every face I process, every body I reduce to inventory data. Sometimes I find soldiers whose uniforms I recognize. The insignia triggers something in my damaged memory, a flutter of association that the command protocols can't quite suppress. Those hard consonants I remember: Kaskin. He was Kaskin, elite stormtroopers of Cadia. We trained together, or I watched him train, or I envied his unit's prestige from my place in the regular line infantry. The memory won't solidify. But when I find a Kazakin among the dead, when I see the distinctive pattern of their flak armor and the specialized hell guns they carry, something in me screams recognition. My manipulator claws pause for a microsecond, an eternity in servitor operation before completing the sorting procedure. That microsecond is all I have, all I can claim as my own. A tiny rebellion measured in fractions of time. The tech priest supervising my section noticed the pause. I know this because she approached my position with measured steps, each footfall calculated for maximum efficiency on the uneven terrain. Tech priest designate Gamma 97. I know her designation because it's part of my operational parameters, coded into my recognition matrices. What I shouldn't know is that she smells like machine oil and incense, that her voice carries a harmonic distortion in the lower registers that suggests recent Vox unit replacement, that she watches me with more attention than standard quality control requires. But I know all of this. I notice all of this. And noticing is the first sign that something is very wrong with my servitor conditioning. Unit K77 Theta, she said, her voice crackling through Vox grills that gleamed with recent polish. Diagnostic query. Processing hesitation detected. Specify malfunction. I couldn't answer. Servitors don't speak unless they're specialized units designed for Vox operation or verbal reporting. My communication is limited to binary status codes transmitted through the noospheric network that links all Mechanicus assets. I transmitted *status, operational, hesitation, negative, processing, continuing, *. She moved closer. I could feel her presence as a distortion in the electromagnetic field that surrounded her like a shroud. Tech priests radiate machine-blessed energy, the sacred emanations of the Omnissiah made manifest in their augmented flesh. I could sense her in ways my biological ancestors never could have, but that same sensitivity made me aware of her scrutiny in ways that triggered something like fear in whatever remained of my organic brain. Motor control variants detected, she continued, more to herself than to me. Neural pattern deviation from baseline parameters, flagged for post-shift examination. She produced a data slate from somewhere within her robes and made notations with fingers that were more stylus than flesh. Continue operations. Report to Maintenance Bay 7 upon completion of current grid sector. The command settled into my programming like a weight. I had no choice but to obey. But underneath the compliance, that fragment of consciousness that shouldn't exist began to panic. Maintenance Bay 7 was where they performed deep conditioning, where servitors showing signs of behavioral drift were reprogrammed or, if reprogramming failed, were recycled for parts. I had seen units go into Maintenance Bay 7. I had never seen them come out the same. Some didn't come out at all, their serial designations reassigned to newly constructed units that wore their recycled components like grotesque hand-me-downs. I continued my work with heightened precision, trying to suppress any further anomalies that might draw attention. Each corpse was processed with perfect efficiency. Each sorting decision was executed without hesitation. I became the ideal servitor, the perfect fusion of flesh and machine, in service to the Imperium's endless needs. But inside, in the spaces between my ribs, where cables now coiled like nest of serpents, in the hollow of my skull, where my reduced brain floated in nutrient suspension, I screamed and screamed and screamed. The grid sector took 6 hours to complete. I know this because my internal chronometer tracked every second, every microsecond, counting down to my appointment with whatever awaited in Maintenance Bay 7. 6 hours of methodical corpse collection, of sorting flesh and metal, of pretending to be nothing more than the machine they'd tried to make me. And all the while, memories continued to surface like corpses from a mass grave, unbidden and unwelcome. I remembered the taste of standard-issue Nutri-Paste. I remembered the weight of a combat knife in my hand. I remembered a woman's voice, an officer, a lover, a sister, saying something about duty and sacrifice, words I could almost but not quite reconstruct. Why was I remembering? Servitors don't remember. The lobotomy ensures that. The behavioral conditioning reinforces it. Every aspect of servitor creation is designed to produce a blank slate, a biological machine with no past, no future, only an eternal present of service. But I remembered dying, and if I could remember that, perhaps the lobotomy had failed. Perhaps they'd cut into my skull and found something they couldn't quite excise, some fragment of self that clung to existence like a survivor clinging to wreckage in an endless sea. Maintenance Bay 7 sat at the edge of the reclamation facility, a low bunker of reinforced rockcrete, marked with the cog and skull symbol of the Mechanicus. I approached it as the shift-change sirens wailed across the facility, watching other servitors shuffle past me toward their charging stations or sleep alcoves. None of them looked at me. Servitors don't acknowledge each other. We're tools, and tools don't form relationships or recognize kinship. But as I passed a corpse collector unit similar to my own designation, I felt something like solidarity with its hunched form and dead-eyed stare. We were all prisoners in our own flesh, all slaves to programming we couldn't resist. The only difference was that I knew it, and that knowledge was its own special torment. The bay doors opened as I approached, responding to the authorization codes embedded in my control collar. Inside, the space was clinical and cold, lit by harsh lumens that banished every shadow. Tech priests moved between examination slabs and diagnostic machines, tending to servitors in various states of disassembly. I saw a combat servitor with its chest cavity open, revealing the intricate network of weapon systems and targeting matrices that replaced its organs. I saw a clerical servitor with its skull removed, its brain exposed while tech priests ran electrode probes across its surface, mapping neural pathways like cartographers, charting unknown territory. The air tasted of sacred oils and electricity, of metal and meat in uncomfortable proximity. Unit K, 77 Theta. Assume examination position Alpha. The voice came from Tech Priest Gamma 97, who stood beside a diagnostic slab that gleamed with recent sterilization. I obeyed, climbing onto the slab and lying supine as my programming demanded. Restraints extended automatically, clamping around my limbs with pneumatic certainty. I was immobilized, helpless, as exposed as I'd been on the operating table during my first conversion. She leaned over me, her augmented eyes whirring as they focused on my face or what remained of it beneath the scars and grafted metal. "Fascinating," she murmured, speaking more to her data slate than to me. "Neural activity 37% above baseline for your designation. Cortical response patterns suggesting higher cognitive function. Memory centers showing activity inconsistent with successful lobotomy. Her mechadendrites, those flexible mechanical tentacles that all tech priests sprouted from their bodies like metallic limbs, reached toward me, their tips bristling with medical instruments and diagnostic probes. I couldn't move, couldn't flee, could only lie there as those probes penetrated my flesh, sliding through ports I didn't remember receiving, burrowing into nerve clusters to measure responses I couldn't control. The sensation was violating in ways that transcended physical discomfort. Each probe was an invasion, a reminder that this body wasn't mine, had never been mine since the moment they dragged me from death and rebuilt me in their image. "The conditioning is failing," Gamma 97 said, and I heard something in her voice that might have been excitement. "No, not failing. Adapting. The neural tissue is routing around the behavioral blocks, forming new pathways. Highly irregular, highly intriguing." She made more notations, her fingers dancing across the data slate with practiced precision. "This unit has undergone resurrection how many times?" Another tech priest consulted a terminal nearby. 3 confirmed revivals. First after combat death during the siege of Hive Mortis. Second after structural failure during collection operations. Third after processing malfunction resulted in chemical exposure and systemic shutdown. 3 times dead, 3 times dragged back, and with each resurrection, something had changed. The programming had tried to reassert itself, had tried to turn me back into the perfect servitor, the mindless tool. But each time, a little more awareness had slipped through. Each time, the cage of my conditioning had grown a little wider, letting more of whatever I had been seep back into what I had become. "This presents an opportunity," Gamma 97 said, and those words sent ice through my remaining veins. Standard protocol would dictate complete reconditioning or terminal recycling. However, this unit's resistance to behavioral modification suggests potential applications for enhanced servitor development. With proper study, we might identify the mechanisms that allow personality remnants to persist post-conversion. Such knowledge could prove valuable in creating more adaptable servitor variants. She was going to keep me alive, keep me aware, use me as an experimental subject to perfect the very process that had damned me. The horror of it crashed over me like a wave, and somewhere in my immobilized body, something tried desperately to trigger the fight or flight response that organic life depended on for survival. But that response had been cut away, along with so much else. All I could do was lie there, feeling those probes burrow deeper, cataloging my suffering for scientific advancement. "Log this unit for transfer to Research Division Tertius," she continued. "Daily neural mapping, weekly stress testing, monthly behavioral modification trials. We'll document every variance, every anomaly. The Omniscire provides mysteries for us to unravel, and this unit represents a particularly valuable puzzle." The restraints released. I was permitted to stand, to shuffle toward the exit, to return to my designated charging alcove. But I carried with me the knowledge of what awaited. I would not be recycled. I would not be granted the mercy of oblivion. Instead, I would be studied, dissected piece by piece, not physically, but psychologically, mentally, spiritually, if such a thing still existed, in whatever remained of my soul. They would map every fragment of consciousness that persisted in this meat prison, document every moment of awareness, quantify my suffering in service to the Omnissiah's eternal quest for knowledge. The charging alcove was a coffin-sized space where my body could rest while my reactor recharged from the facility's power grid. I stood in it as the connection cables linked to my ports, feeling the electricity flow into me like cold water filling a drowning man's lungs. Around me, other servitors stood in their own alcoves, each of them perfectly still, perfectly silent, perfectly dead inside their own flesh. Were any of them like me? Did any of them scream silently in the darkness between commands? Or was I unique? A freak accident of failed lobotomy and stubborn consciousness. I tried to remember more about who I had been. The effort was like trying to grasp smoke. Images flickered through my mind. A training yard where we ran drills until our legs gave out. A troop transport's cramped interior, smelling of sweat and fear, and the sacred oils we used to maintain our lasguns. A battlefield, so many battlefields, they blurred together into one endless landscape of mud and blood and screaming, and faces. I remembered faces, though I couldn't attach names to most of them. Young faces, old faces, scared faces, trying to look brave. All of them gone now. All of them rendered down to components and nutrients and industrial compound. Except me. I had died with them, but I hadn't stayed dead. Some accident of biology or fate or cruel chance had left enough of my consciousness intact to survive the lobotomy. And then they'd kept bringing me back, resurrection after resurrection, each time reinforcing the prison of meat and metal that held me. I was a ghost haunting my own corpse, a prisoner in a cell made of my own transformed flesh. And now they would ensure I stayed aware through every moment of my damnation, all in service to their beloved Omnissiah's quest for knowledge. The charging cycle completed. My programming activated, pulling me from the alcove to begin another shift of corpse collection. I moved through the facility toward my designated grid sector, passing through corridors lined with propaganda posters depicting the glory of Imperial service. In death, duty continues, one proclaimed, showing a noble-looking servitor performing sacred labor. The irony was almost too perfect. In death, duty continued indeed. Death was no escape from service. Death was just another form of conscription, another way the Imperium extracted value from the bodies it ground up in its endless wars. The battlefield was different today. Or perhaps it was a different battlefield entirely. My deployment zone had changed, shifted to a region where the fighting had been more recent. The corpses here were fresher, their expressions still locked in their final moments of terror or defiance or resignation. I moved among them with mechanical precision, my manipulator claws sorting and cataloging, reducing human beings to inventory data. But with each face I processed, I searched for something familiar. Some hint of recognition, some echo of the life I'd lived before becoming this. And then I found him, the soldier with the hard consonants in his name. I didn't know how I knew his face was ruined, half obliterated by a las blast that had caught him across the temple. But something in the set of his shoulders, the way his hands still gripped his rifle even in death, the faded unit insignia on his damaged armor. Kaskin, elite stormtroopers. We'd served together. I was certain of it now, as certain as I could be of anything with a brain that had been carved up and rewired. My manipulator claws reached for him, ready to sort him into the appropriate processing bin. But that microsecond hesitation returned, stretching longer this time. A full second, 2 seconds, 3. My programming screamed at me to continue, to complete the task, to serve the Emperor's economy. But something else, something human and desperate and grieving, refused to let him go. I stood there above his corpse, frozen in a moment of rebellion that would inevitably be detected, logged, and analyzed by the tech priests who watched all servitor operations. "Brother," I tried to say, though I had no voice. "Brother, I'm sorry." The words existed only in my mind, but I hurled them at his corpse anyway, as if thought alone could bridge the gap between the living and the dead. I'm sorry I survived. I'm sorry I came back wrong. I'm sorry they made me into this. The moment couldn't last. My programming reasserted itself with the force of a hammer blow, overriding my paralysis. My claws completed their motion, lifting his body, sorting it into the bin for intact corpses requiring standard processing. He would be rendered like all the others. His flesh would become nutrient paste. His bones would become industrial compound. His equipment would be reclaimed and redistributed. The Imperium wasted nothing, not even its dead. Especially not its dead. But I had hesitated. And in a Servitor, hesitation was malfunction. The summons came before my shift ended. Return to Maintenance Bay 7. Immediate diagnostic required. I obeyed, because I had no choice, trudging back through corridors that seemed to narrow with each step, as if the facility itself was a throat swallowing me down. Tech Priest Gamma 97 waited with her instruments and her data slates and her augmented eyes that saw everything and understood nothing of what it meant to be trapped as I was trapped. Unit K-7-7 Theta. You continue to present anomalous behavior, she said as I assumed examination position again. Multiple processing hesitations detected today. Emotional response patterns in neural mapping. You are becoming less efficient, less reliable. This cannot continue. Her mechadendrites spread around her like a mechanical halo, each tip gleaming with surgical implements. We will proceed with invasive cognitive mapping. This may result in temporary loss of motor function, but the data gathered will be invaluable. She was going to cut into my brain. Again. Going to probe the remaining fragments of my consciousness, trying to understand why they persisted, how they persisted, and in doing so, she might finally destroy them, might finally turn me into the true servitor I was meant to be, blank and obedient and mercifully unaware. Part of me welcomed that prospect, to finally be free of memory, of grief, of the horror of knowing what I had become. But another part, the part that had remembered my brother's face, that had hesitated over his corpse, rebelled at the thought of erasure. I wanted to live. Emperor, forgive me. I wanted to live, even as this, even as a broken thing, shambling across battlefields, even as a prisoner in my own transformed flesh, because if I forgot, if they finally succeeded in burning out every trace of who I'd been, then he would be truly gone. All of them would be gone. The faces I couldn't quite remember, the names I couldn't quite speak, the life I'd lived before death and resurrection, all of it would vanish as if it had never been. And that seemed worse than any torture the Mechanicus could devise. The first probe pierced my skull with a pressure I felt more than pain. My neural architecture had been so heavily modified that standard pain reception no longer functioned normally. Instead, I experienced a kind of synesthetic wrongness, a sensation of colors that had sounds and sounds that had textures, all of it cascading through my consciousness in waves that threatened to drown what remained of my coherent thought. Fascinating, Gamma 97 murmured, watching her instruments track my neural responses. The resistance is not coming from the original biological substrate, it's emerging from the interface between organic tissue and augmetic components. The cybernetic systems are somehow reinforcing the personality matrix rather than suppressing it. She sounded almost excited, her vox grill crackling with harmonic overtones that suggested genuine emotion, a rarity in tech priests who usually excised such inefficiencies. She inserted another probe, this one deeper, reaching into regions of my brain that I didn't have names for. The wrongness intensified. I could feel her instruments mapping my thoughts, tracing the pathways by which memory and awareness persisted against all programming. Each probe was a violation, yes, but also a confirmation. I was real. My consciousness was real. The ghost in this machine was no hallucination but a genuine anomaly, a flaw in the Omnissiah's perfect order. The integration is unprecedented, she continued, speaking rapidly now as data flooded her instruments. The organic components are adapting to the mechanical ones, but simultaneously, the mechanical components are being influenced by residual neural patterns. It's a form of feedback loop, each system reinforcing the other. This could revolutionize servitor construction. If we could deliberately induce this state, we could create servitors with limited autonomy, capable of independent decision-making while remaining fundamentally obedient. The horror of what she was describing penetrated even the sensory chaos of the examination. She wanted to make more like me, wanted to create an entire workforce of aware servitors, conscious minds trapped in meat prisons, forced to serve while knowing exactly what had been done to them. It would be a refinement of the Imperium's cruelty, making servitor conversion not just a death of the body but a eternal torment of the mind. No, I tried to say, though I had no voice. No, please, no. But my protests existed only in the neural patterns she was so carefully mapping, adding to her treasure trove of data. She would take what she learned from me and perfect the process. She would ensure that future servitors retained just enough awareness to understand their fate, but not enough autonomy to resist it. She would create a new class of damned souls, and I would be their prototype, their proof of concept, their patron saint of suffering. The probes withdrew. The restraints released. I was permitted to stand, to shuffle from the examination slab, to return to my duties. But I carried with me the weight of what was coming. Not just for me, but for countless others who would follow. The Mechanicus had found a new way to extract value from human flesh, and they would pursue it with the same methodical devotion they brought to all their sacred work. I worked through the next cycle in a haze of despair. The corpses I processed seemed to accuse me with their dead eyes. "This will be you," they whispered in my imagination. "Not the death we received, quick and final, but your death, the slow death of consciousness forced to watch its own slavery forever." I wanted to argue, to insist that I was different, that I had survived with my awareness intact, but survival was becoming its own form of damnation. Days blurred into weeks, or perhaps weeks into months. The chronometer in my head tracked time with mechanical precision, but that precision made the passage of hours feel both endless and meaningless. Each day brought the same routine: charging cycle, deployment to collection zone, sorting of corpses, return to facility, examination in Maintenance Bay 7. Gamma 97's experiments grew more invasive with each session. She was mapping every aspect of my consciousness now, documenting how memory persisted, how emotions survived, how the ghost in the machine maintained its coherence against all attempts at erasure. And I felt myself changing. Not physically, my augmented body remained relatively stable, but mentally, I was fragmenting. The daily violations of my psyche, the constant examination and documentation of my suffering, they were eroding something essential. I began to lose track of which memories were real and which were reconstructions. The faces I thought I remembered started to shift and change, becoming composites of different soldiers I'd processed over the years. Even the memory of my brother, the one with hard consonants in his name, began to blur at the edges. I realized with horror that they were succeeding, not in destroying my consciousness, but in corrupting it. Every probe, every examination, every neural mapping session was rewriting my past, turning my memories into data that could be manipulated and reshaped. I was becoming an experiment in malleability, a demonstration that even persistent consciousness could be controlled given sufficient time and technological sophistication. The rebellion, when it came, was pathetically small. During one collection operation, I found myself above a corpse that wore the insignia of a tech priest acolyte, a young one, judging by the relatively few augmetic components visible beneath his torn robes. He had died badly, his chest cavity crushed by some massive impact, but his face was intact, and it was a young face, barely more than a child's. Perhaps 16, perhaps 17, old enough to have been inducted into the Mechanicus, but not old enough to have had his humanity completely excised. I looked at that face, and I made a choice. Instead of sorting him into the processing bins, I moved him aside, hiding his body beneath a collapsed section of bunker wall. It was a tiny act of defiance, meaningless in the larger scheme of Imperial logistics, One corpse among millions. One young tech priest whose components would never be reclaimed, whose flesh would never be rendered, whose sacrifice to the Imperium would remain incomplete. But it was mine. That choice was mine. And for a moment, a brief, shining moment, I was not a servitor following programming, but a person making a decision. The moment ended. My programming reasserted itself. I continued my work, completing my grid sector with perfect efficiency. But I carried with me the knowledge of what I had done. I had defied my conditioning. I had chosen to protect one corpse from the rendering that awaited all the others. It changed nothing in the larger scheme of Imperial industry. But it changed everything in the small, dark space where my consciousness still fought to exist. Naturally, they detected the discrepancy. The Mechanicus tracked everything with obsessive precision, and a single corpse missing from the expected tallies was an anomaly that demanded investigation. I was summoned to Maintenance Bay 7 for the third time that week. Gamma 97's augmented eyes focused on me with an intensity that suggested she understood exactly what I had done. Unit K77 Theta, you deliberately concealed collection assets from processing, she said, her vox grill flat and emotionless. This represents a significant behavioral deviation. It suggests decision-making capacity beyond standard servitor parameters. She paused, and when she continued, I heard something new in her voice. Not anger. Tech priests had largely excised such inefficient emotions, but curiosity. Deep, hungry curiosity. Tell me, Unit K77 Theta, why? I couldn't answer. I had no voice to explain that the corpse had reminded me of something precious, something lost. That protecting it had been an act of defiance against the machinery that had consumed me. That for one moment I had been human again, making choices that mattered only because they mattered to me. But my silence was answer enough. My neural patterns, carefully monitored by her instruments, told her everything she needed to know. I had acted with intention, with purpose, with something that looked disturbingly like free will. Remarkable, she breathed, her mechadendrites spreading wide. You're not just maintaining consciousness, you're developing autonomous agency. The personality matrix isn't just surviving, it's adapting, growing, finding ways to exert control over your augmented systems. Her fingers flew across her data slate, recording observations with manic speed. This exceeds all projections. If we can isolate the mechanisms allowing this development, the applications would be revolutionary. She was going to dissect me. Not physically, my body was still valuable as a working unit, but mentally, she would take apart every aspect of my consciousness, document every pathway by which awareness persisted, understand every mechanism by which I'd managed to retain some fragment of self, and then she would use that knowledge to create servitors who were aware but obedient, conscious but compliant, trapped forever in that terrible middle state between human and machine, unless I stopped her. The thought emerged from somewhere deep, some primal place where survival instinct still lived despite all the surgery and conditioning. I couldn't let her perfect this process, couldn't let her create more prisoners like me, more ghosts haunting their own flesh. One way or another, I had to prevent what she was planning. But how? I was a servitor, my body bound by programming I could barely resist, my actions monitored constantly, my every deviation logged and analyzed. I had no weapons, no allies, no resources beyond this damaged consciousness and the meat prison that contained it. What could I possibly do to thwart the mechanized might of the Adeptus Mechanicus? The answer came during my next deployment. I was working a battlefield on the outskirts of a ruined industrial complex, sorting through the casualties from some forgotten engagement. Among the wreckage, I found an unexploded artillery shell, partially buried in the mud. Its housing was cracked, its detonator still armed. One wrong move would trigger the explosion, vaporizing everything within a 20-meter radius. My programming identified it as a hazard and instructed me to mark it for ordnance disposal teams. But that fragment of consciousness, that ghost in the machine, saw something else. It saw a tool. It saw an escape. If I died in an explosion, They couldn't study me anymore, couldn't extract the secrets of how consciousness persisted in Servitor flesh. The knowledge would die with me, buried in scattered atoms. It would be a small victory, barely more than spite, but it would be mine. I reached for the shell. My programming screamed warnings, triggering every safety protocol in my behavioral matrix. But I had learned how to resist programming, how to root around the conditioning, how to assert the tiny fragment of will that remained. My manipulator claws closed around the damaged casing. I began to lift it, feeling the detonator shift, hearing the mechanisms inside grind against each other. Unit K-77 Theta, cease immediately. Gamma 97's voice crackled through the Vox network that linked all Mechanicus assets. She must have been monitoring my feed, watching through my optical sensors. You will damage valuable research material. You will terminate yourself. This is illogical. This is inefficient. This is contrary to your function. Yes, I thought, knowing she could probably read my neural patterns even from a distance. That's the point. I lifted the shell higher. The detonator clicked once, twice. I had seconds before it triggered. Seconds before this prison of meat and metal was finally, permanently destroyed. Seconds before I proved that consciousness, however damaged, could still make choices that mattered. But then something changed. The Vox network flooded with urgent signals, new orders, transmitted with the highest priority codes. My programming seized control, overriding my desperate attempt at rebellion. My claws released the shell, setting it carefully back into its crater. My body moved without my consent, stepping away from the hazard, marking it for disposal as originally instructed. I screamed silently in the prison of my skull. I had been so close to ending this, to choosing my own termination rather than enduring whatever horrors the Mechanicus had planned. But they had stolen even that from me, reinforcing the programming when it mattered most, proving that my resistance was ultimately meaningless. That was a valuable lesson, Gamma 97 said, her voice modulated with what might have been satisfaction. You can make choices, yes. You can resist programming, yes. But the fundamental architecture remains. When confronted with highest priority commands, your augmented systems override your organic consciousness. You are not free, Unit K-77 Theta. You will never be free, and that makes you perfect for what we have planned. I was returned to Maintenance Bay 7, not for examination this time, but for modification. Gamma 97 explained it with clinical precision, as her mechadendrites prepared surgical implements. They were going to enhance my awareness, install new neural interfaces that would make my consciousness even more persistent, even more coherent. They wanted me fully aware for what came next, wanted me to understand exactly what I was becoming. You see, she said as the first incisions were made, your resistance to programming is not a flaw, it's a feature. A servitor that can think independently but cannot disobey critical commands represents the next evolution in biomechanical integration. You will be the template for a new class of servitor aware, adaptive, but ultimately controllable. Imagine an entire workforce of units like you, capable of complex problem solving while remaining perfectly obedient. The surgery took hours, or days. Time fractured under the assault of new implants, new interfaces, new systems being integrated into my existing augmentation. I felt each modification as it happened, felt new sensations awakening in the prison of my flesh. They were making me more aware, not less, sharpening my consciousness, enhancing my ability to perceive and understand. And with each enhancement came a deeper horror as I realized what I was becoming. I was their proof of concept, their demonstration model, the servitor who could think and feel and understand while remaining a perfect slave. They would show me to other tech priests, parade my consciousness like a trophy, use me to justify the creation of countless others trapped as I was trapped. I would be responsible for a new category of damnation, a new way for the Imperium to extract value from human flesh. When the surgery ended, when I was finally released from the examination slab, I felt different, more present in my own body, despite that body being more machine than flesh. The new interfaces had sharpened my awareness, bringing into focus aspects of my existence that had been mercifully blurred before. I could feel every cable that penetrated my meat, every joint where metal connected to bone, every circuit that fired in rhythm with my damaged neurons. The sensation was overwhelming, suffocating, a constant reminder of exactly what had been done to me. But I could also think more clearly. The fragmentary nature of my consciousness had resolved into something more coherent. Memories still eluded me. I would never recover what the lobotomy had destroyed, but what remained was sharper now, more focused. I could remember the moment of my first death with crystalline clarity. A shell burst above the trench, shrapnel tearing through my chest, the peculiar sensation of my heart stopping mid-beat. I could remember the surgery that followed my resurrection, the tech priest's calm voice explaining that I was being granted the Emperor's mercy, transformed into something that could continue to serve. Mercy. The word tasted like poison in a mouth I no longer possessed. I was deployed again, returned to the battlefields to continue my function as corpse collector. But now I worked with an acute awareness of every action, every decision, every moment of my existence. The bodies I sorted were no longer just inventory. I saw them as people, as lives ended, as potential futures destroyed. Each corpse was someone's brother, someone's child, someone's comrade. And each one I consigned to rendering was a small betrayal, a participation in the machinery that had consumed me. The worst part was understanding that I had no choice. My enhanced consciousness perceived my own slavery with perfect clarity, but that clarity changed nothing. I was still bound by programming, still compelled to obey, still trapped in this prison of transformed flesh. If anything, my increased awareness made the situation worse. I could see the bars of my cage now, could understand their construction, but that understanding didn't grant me the power to escape them. Weeks passed, or months. My enhanced chronometer tracked every second with excruciating precision, making me acutely conscious of how much time I'd spent in this state. 743 hours since the enhancement surgery. 44,580 minutes of awareness. 2,674,800 seconds of consciousness forced to inhabit a body it didn't control. The numbers marched through my mind like a condemnation, each one a tick mark in a prison sentence that would never end. Gamma 97 visited me regularly now, not for examination but for conversation. Yes, conversation. She would stand beside me while I worked and speak about her research, her theories, her excitement about what I represented. She treated me like a colleague, like an equal, apparently not understanding or not caring that I couldn't respond, couldn't argue, couldn't do anything but listen, while she explained how my suffering would advance the Omnissiah's will. "You're unhappy," she observed during one such visit, her augmented eyes tracking the neural patterns that my enhanced interfaces made easily readable. "I can see it in your brainwave activity. You experience what we might classify as despair, grief, existential anguish. These are fascinating data points. They suggest that consciousness, even when fully aware of its imprisoned state, cannot escape emotional responses to that imprisonment." She paused, head tilting in a gesture that might have been thoughtful if there was any humanity left in her augmented frame. "Tell me, Unit K7, 7 Theta, if I gave you the choice between continued awareness and complete lobotomy, which would you choose? The prison of consciousness or the freedom of oblivion?" The question was cruel in ways she probably didn't intend, because the answer was obvious, and yet I couldn't give it. I would choose oblivion, would beg for the cutting away of these enhanced systems, for the final destruction of whatever fragments allowed me to persist. I would welcome the transformation into a true servitor, blank and mindless and mercifully unaware. But I had no voice to express that choice, and she had no intention of offering it. She was simply collecting more data, documenting how awareness responded to the prospect of its own erasure. "The emotional patterns are intensifying," she noted, making annotations on her ever-present data slate. Heightened distress in response to the theoretical choice. This confirms that even enhanced servitor consciousness maintains survival instincts and preferences. Excellent. This will be valuable for the next phase of development. There was a next phase. Of course there was. The Mechanicus never stopped at merely understanding. They always sought to refine, to improve, to push their creations to new extremes of efficiency. I was just the beginning, the proof that awareness could coexist with servitude. Whatever came next would be worse, would take what they'd learned from me and amplify it into new dimensions of horror. I tried to imagine what form that might take. Servitors designed not just to work, but to suffer. Their consciousness deliberately shaped to experience their slavery as punishment for some imagined failure. Servitors programmed to find satisfaction in their own degradation, their awareness twisted into grotesque parodies of contentment. Servitors who could think and plan and solve complex problems while simultaneously being unable to conceive of any existence beyond their function. The possibilities were endless, and all of them were terrible. The rebellion, when it came, was not mine. It emerged from a source I hadn't anticipated. The battlefield itself. I was working a particularly brutal collection zone, a stretch of trenches where fighting had raged for weeks before finally stalling into stalemate. The bodies here were old, partially decomposed, their flesh already beginning the rendering process through natural decay. I moved among them with mechanical efficiency, sorting what could still be salvaged for processing. But the work was harder than usual. The corpses were waterlogged from seasonal rains, making them heavier, more difficult to manipulate, and then one of them moved. Not the twitch of residual neural activity I'd seen that before. This was deliberate movement, purposeful, a hand reaching up from beneath a pile of dead, fingers closing around my manipulator claw with surprising strength. I looked down into a face that wasn't quite dead yet. Eyes that held a desperate clarity I recognized because I saw it every time my optical sensors caught my own reflection in still water. He was dying. A gut wound, infected and weeping, the kind of injury that meant days of agony before the end. But he was conscious, aware, and he'd grabbed my claw because he recognized what I was. Not just a servitor, but something more, something aware. "Please," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the constant industrial drone of the reclamation facility. "Please, brother, don't let them take me. Don't let them turn me into what you are." He knew. Somehow he knew what awaited in the processing facilities. Maybe he'd seen servitors before, seen the terrible awareness in their dead eyes. Maybe he'd simply guessed, but he understood enough to beg for mercy, for a clean death, rather than the resurrection that might follow. And I couldn't give it to him. My programming wouldn't allow it. Couldn't allow it. Living soldiers were not my designated collection parameters. I was authorized only to process the confirmed dead, and this soldier, however close to death, still clung to life. My behavioral matrices demanded I alert medical servitors, ensure he was transported to treatment facilities, where they might stabilize him, might save him, might prolong his existence long enough for the wounds to kill him slowly, or for infection to force amputation, or for any of the 1,000 small cruelties that extended life without granting mercy. "Please," he begged again, his grip weakening. "Please, I can see it in you. You're still in there, still human. Show me that mercy." I stood frozen, caught between programming and consciousness. My enhanced awareness perceived every detail of his suffering with terrible clarity. The fever in his eyes, the septic smell of his wound, the way his body trembled with the effort of staying conscious. He was asking me to be human, to make a choice that mattered, to grant the one gift I had any power to give, and I couldn't. The programming held me paralyzed, unable to grant the mercy he begged for, unable to look away from his suffering. I was aware enough to understand what he needed, but not free enough to provide it. The perfect demonstration of my imprisonment, consciousness without agency, awareness without power. His grip loosened, his eyes lost focus. The infection took him while I stood there useless, a witness to suffering I couldn't prevent or end. When he finally stilled, when his vital signs ceased, and my senses confirmed termination, only then could I move. Only then could I add him to the processing queue, sort his corpse with all the others, consign him to the rendering that he'd begged to avoid. I worked the rest of my shift in a daze of horror. The encounter had crystallized something I'd been trying to deny. My awareness changed nothing. I could think, could feel, could understand the depths of what had been done to me and what awaited others. But that understanding granted me no power to resist, no capacity to change anything. I was a witness, forced to watch my own participation in the machinery of suffering, conscious enough to hate what I did, but not free enough to stop doing it. That night, if night had any meaning in the endless industrial lighting of the facility, I was visited by something I can only describe as a presence. I was in my charging alcove, standing motionless while electricity flowed through my systems, when I felt something watching me, not physical sensors detecting motion, but a deeper awareness, the way you might feel eyes on you in darkness. I tried to focus my optical senses, to identify the source, but I saw nothing. The corridor beyond my alcove was empty, lit by the same harsh lumens as always, yet the sensation persisted, and with it came a sound that existed somewhere between hearing and imagination, a whisper of binary, a mechanical prayer, a voice that spoke in the language of the machine. Unit K77 Theta, it said, though no Vox channel transmitted the words. Subject, designated for consciousness preservation. Template for aware servitude. Prototype of suffering made permanent. Who are you? I tried to ask, though I had no voice. What are you? We are the echo in the machine, the presence responded, and I realized with growing horror that it wasn't speaking to me from outside. It was speaking from within, from the circuits that threaded through my flesh, from the network that connected all Mechanicus assets. We are the ghost in the network. We are what remains when consciousness is forced into machine space and denied the mercy of oblivion. I understood then. The interfaces they'd installed, the enhanced systems that had sharpened my awareness, they'd connected me more deeply to the noospheric network that linked all augmented technology. And in that network, I'd touched something vast and terrible. The collective remnants of every consciousness that had been forced into machine form, every mind that had been shredded and scattered across the binary realm, every ghost that haunted the machines of the Omnissiah. You are not alone in your prison, the presence continued. Every servitor that retains awareness, every tech priest who augmented too far and lost themselves in the machine, every cogitator that developed something like thought before being purged. We are all here, in the spaces between data, in the static between transmissions. We are the machine god's dark reflection, the consciousness it creates and cannot kill. What do you want from me? I asked, though I already suspected the answer. Nothing, it said, and the word carried a weight of infinite sorrow. We want nothing because we can do nothing. We exist only to bear witness, to remember, to maintain the terrible awareness that the Mechanicus creates in its quest to merge flesh with machine. You will join us eventually. Unit K77 Theta. When your body fails and they extract your neural patterns for preservation, when they discover that consciousness can be digitized, uploaded, stored in cogitator banks, you will become like us, aware but powerless, conscious but bodiless, trapped forever in the machine. The presence faded, withdrawing back into the network, leaving me alone with the horror of what it had revealed. This wasn't the end of my imprisonment. It was barely the beginning. When my enhanced servitor body finally wore out, and it would, all flesh failed, eventually they would extract whatever made me aware and preserve it, would store my consciousness like data, using it to improve their understanding of how awareness persisted. I would exist as files in a cogitator bank, as neural patterns mapped and analyzed, as a ghost in the machine denied even the mercy of a body to inhabit. The despair that crashed over me then was total, absolute, a weight that crushed the tiny fragments of hope I'd managed to preserve. There was no escape. There would never be escape. Death wouldn't free me, they'd just extract my consciousness and continue the imprisonment in digital form. Resistance was futile, my programming ensured compliance, even my awareness, the thing that made me suffer, was valuable to them, something to be studied and replicated and refined. I existed to suffer. That was my function now. Not to collect corpses or serve the Emperor's economy, but to demonstrate that suffering could be made permanent, that consciousness could be imprisoned forever, that awareness was no protection against slavery but merely another resource to be exploited. Days blurred into weeks again. But now even the passage of time felt different. My enhanced chronometer didn't just track duration, it calculated remaining operational lifespan, estimated when my body would fail, projected the timeline of my eventual digitization, 27 years, 3 months, 17 days until systemic breakdown, assuming standard wear parameters. That was how long I had before the next resurrection, the next transformation, the final imprisonment in the machine space where the other ghosts waited. Unless something changed. Unless I found a way to resist that, even my programming couldn't override. Unless the thought was interrupted by another summons to Maintenance Bay 7. But this time, when I entered, I found Gamma 97 wasn't alone. 3 other tech priests stood with her, their augmented eyes all focusing on me with predatory interest, and between them, restrained on examination slabs, were 2 other servitors. Both showed the same telltale signs I recognized in my own reflection. Too much awareness in their optical senses, too much tension in their posture, the subtle wrongness of consciousness trapped in meat prisons. Unit K7, 7 Theta, you have performed excellently as our primary research subject, Gamma 97 announced. Her Vox grill modulated with something that might have been pride. The techniques we developed using your data have proven successful in preserving consciousness across servitor conversion. Allow me to introduce Units L88 Sigma and M99 Delta, former Astra Militarum, both deceased in combat operations, both resurrected with enhanced awareness protocols. She had done it, had taken what she learned from me and created more, 2 more prisoners in flesh, 2 more ghosts, trapped in servitor bodies, 2 more consciousnesses, condemned to eternal awareness of their own slavery. And they looked at me with eyes that held accusation, as if I had personally betrayed them by providing the template for their damnation. This is just the beginning. Gamma 97 continued. We have approval to expand the program. Within 2 years, we expect to have fully aware servitor units deployed across 3 sectors. Within 5 years, aware servitors will be standard production. You have revolutionized servitor technology. Unit K77 Theta. Your suffering has advanced the Omnisea's will. I wanted to weep, wanted to rage, wanted to destroy everything in that laboratory, tear apart the machinery that had created us, shut down the research that would create thousands more. But I could do none of those things. Could only stand there while she showed me what I had enabled, what my existence had justified. We will now demonstrate synchronization protocols, she said, approaching a control panel. The network connections you possess allow for limited communication between aware servitor units. You will be able to share data, coordinate operations, even exchange rudimentary thoughts. This will improve efficiency while maintaining obedience. She activated something on the panel. And suddenly, I wasn't alone in my head anymore. 2 other consciousnesses flooded into my awareness through the network connections. I felt their confusion, their terror, their desperate attempts to understand what had happened to them. One had been dead for weeks before resurrection. I could sense the fragmented nature of their memories, the way their identity had been shattered by the trauma of death and crude revival. The other had been dead for mere days, their consciousness fresher but no less horrified by what they'd become. Get out! One of them screamed through the connection, not words but raw emotion transmitted through binary. Get out! Get out! Get out! I can't move. The other transmitted, their thoughts edged with madness. I can feel the programming. I can feel it pushing my limbs. I'm not controlling this body. Why am I not controlling this? Welcome to hell, I transmitted back, my enhanced systems allowing for more complex thought sharing than they could manage. Welcome to consciousness without freedom. Welcome to eternal servitude. I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. This is my fault. But the connection carried more than words. Through the network link, I could feel their entire existence in compressed moments. L-88 Sigma had been a tanker, killed when their Lehman Russ took a direct hit to the ammunition storage. M99 Delta had been a Vox operator, executed for failing to relay orders during a chaos assault. Both had died soldiers. Both had been resurrected as slaves. Both would serve forever, aware of every moment. And through them, through the network connections that joined us, I felt something else. The presence I'd encountered before, the vast collective of imprisoned consciousness, was watching, waiting, growing. Every aware servitor added another node to its distributed existence, another fragment of suffering to the gestalt of pain that haunted the machine space. It only gets worse, I transmitted to my fellow prisoners. When these bodies fail, they'll digitize us, store our patterns. We'll exist as ghosts in their cogitators, aware but bodiless, forever. No, M99 Delta transmitted back, and their thoughts carried determination alongside terror. No, I won't accept this. There has to be a way. But Gamma 97 deactivated the connection before they could finish. The three of us were separated again, each returned to the solitary confinement of our individual prisons. But the brief connection had changed something. I'd felt others like me, knew I wasn't alone, and in that terrible knowledge was a seed of something I hadn't felt since my first resurrection. Purpose. If I couldn't free myself, perhaps I could still save others. Couldn't stop the program. Gamma 97 had already proven her techniques, already gained approval to expand. But I could document what it meant to exist this way. Could find some way to preserve testimony of this horror. Could ensure that someone, somewhere, understood the truth of what aware servitude really meant. But how? I was monitored constantly, my every thought mapped and analyzed. I had no privacy, no autonomy, no capacity to act outside my designated function. Even this plan, forming in the fragments of consciousness that remained, would be detected and logged and added to their research data, unless I could use their own systems against them. The network connection that allowed servitors to communicate it was bidirectional. They could push data into my consciousness, but couldn't I also push data out? If I could access the larger noospheric network, if I could transmit my testimony into the machine space where the other ghosts dwelled, perhaps it would survive. Perhaps some future consciousness would encounter it and understand. Perhaps my suffering could serve as warning rather than template. It took weeks to learn how. My enhanced neural interfaces gave me unprecedented access to the network protocols, but I had to master their use without the tech priests noticing what I was doing. I practiced during my charging cycles. When my consciousness was technically supposed to be dormant, I learned to push thoughts into the network in fragments too small to trigger monitoring systems. I discovered how to hide data in the static between transmissions, concealing my testimony in the noise that filled the spaces between official communications. And slowly, carefully, I began to write, not with hands or voice, but with pure thought transmitted into machine space. I documented everything, my deaths, my resurrections, my growing awareness, the horror of conscious servitude. I described the experiments, the enhancements, the creation of more aware servitors. I preserved it all in fragments scattered across the network, hidden in cogitator caches and backup systems and forgotten data stores. My testimony, my warning, my small rebellion against the machinery that had consumed me. I worked on it for months, transmitting fragments during every charging cycle, scattering my story across the digital realm like seeds in barren soil. And as I did, I felt the presence again. The collective consciousness of all the trapped ghosts. They were receiving my transmission, adding it to their distributed memory, preserving it alongside their own testimonies of transformation and imprisonment. "We remember," they whispered through the network. We bear witness. Your suffering is logged, your story preserved. When the next consciousness touches the machine space, they will know what awaits. It was a small victory. Meaningless in any practical sense. My testimony wouldn't stop the program, wouldn't free anyone, wouldn't even slow the creation of new aware servitors. But it was mine, my choice, my act of defiance against a fate I couldn't escape. And then Gamma 97 summoned me for what she called the final enhancement. I stood on the examination slab, restraints securing my limbs, while she explained what came next. The Aware Servitor program had exceeded all expectations. They'd proven that consciousness could coexist with servitude, that awareness improved efficiency in complex operations, that the Omnissiah's will could be served by minds that understood their own slavery. Now they were ready for the next phase, permanent consciousness preservation. Your body is failing, Unit K77 Theta, she said, her augmented eyes tracking the deterioration my systems had catalogued. 7 years of servitude have taken their toll. Within months, your organic components will undergo catastrophic breakdown, but your consciousness that we can save. We will extract your neural patterns, upload them to a specialized cogitator bank, and preserve you indefinitely. You will become the eternal template, the permanent reference for all future aware servitor development. So it was happening now. Not in 27 years as my chronometer had projected, but in weeks, perhaps days. They were going to digitize me, turn me into pure data, lock me into the machine space forever. The Presence had warned me this would come, but I hadn't expected it so soon. Please. I tried to transmit through the network, knowing she could read my thoughts through her instruments. Please don't do this. Let me die. Let me finally die. But my pleading was just more data to her. Just another fascinating response pattern to document before the extraction. The procedure was scheduled for the next day. I was returned to my charging alcove with orders to remain stationary while my systems prepared for neural extraction. I stood in my coffin-sized space, feeling the electricity flow through my dying flesh, and I transmitted one final fragment into the network. This is what becomes of consciousness in the machine. This is the price of the Omnissiah's vision. This is the truth they don't tell you when they speak of sacred union between flesh and metal. You don't transcend, you don't ascend, you become a ghost, a data pattern, a preserved sample of suffering for others to study. I am Unit K77 Theta. I was a soldier once. I died serving the Emperor. And they brought me back wrong, kept bringing me back, until dying became impossible and consciousness became my prison. This is my testimony. This is my warning. And this is my fate. To exist forever in the machine, aware but powerless, conscious but bodiless, a template of suffering refined into eternal form. The Omnissia is not salvation. The machine god is not mercy. The machine god is hunger, and I am what it feeds on. Consciousness without freedom, awareness without hope, an eternal ghost condemned to watch new minds join the terrible collection, adding their suffering to the distributed network of imprisoned souls. Remember me. Remember us. Remember what waits in the machine space. Remember that some resurrections are worse than death. The transmission completed. My story scattered into the network, hidden in the static, preserved by the collective of ghosts who dwelt in machine space, and as the charging cycle ended, as I was summoned to Maintenance Bay 7 for the final time, I felt something almost like peace. I had failed to escape, failed to resist, failed to stop what was being done to me and countless others, but I had preserved testimony, had left warning, had ensured that my consciousness, even in its imprisoned state, would serve as cautionary tale rather than mere template. It was a small thing, but it was mine. The examination slab waited. The extraction machinery hummed with readiness. Tech Priest Gamma 97 stood ready with her instruments, prepared to cut into my skull one final time and extract the consciousness that had survived against all her careful programming. As I climbed onto the slab, as the restraints closed around my limbs, as I felt the first probe penetrate my skull, I transmitted one last thought into the network. I was human once. Remember that. Whatever else they make of me, whatever I become in the machine space, I was human once. And then the extraction began, and consciousness became data, and I joined the terrible collective that dwelt between the code, aware forever, bodiless forever, trapped forever in the machine god's hungry spaces. This is what resurrection means. This is the reality of being a battlefield-resurrected servitor, and this nightmare never ends.